Well, good morning or good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I think almost whatever part of the Western world you are, it's probably the afternoon or the evening, but certainly where Amir is in Columbus, Ohio, it is the afternoon. So good afternoon, Amir.
Good afternoon, Graham. Pleasure to see you.
And you. For those of you who don't know Amir is the man at Longwoods. He's the top man at Longwoods International, which is a research organization purely focused on tourism and travel. He's extremely well known throughout the United States. He's almost constantly in an aeroplane or in a car going around and talking about his research and his company to destination management organizations. And he's kept both ourselves, Travel Mole, and the rest of the world up to date on all sorts of things about the effect of the pandemic and now fuel costs. So how's it going, Amir?
Well, things here in Columbus are doing well today. Beautiful spring weather, but more importantly, here in the U.S., the travel industry is getting into full recovery mode now in many aspects, and still a long ways to go for certain things, but much more optimistic than we were, say, 12 months ago.
Well, 12 months ago, obviously, we were in the sort of depths of despair with regard to the pandemic. Your research would suggest that it's typical in the travel industry that one hurdle goes away and another one will be put up in our way. And in the States, as far as travel is concerned, the pandemic is on the wane, and higher fuel costs and generally cost of living seems to be increasing. That might be a stymie for a full expansion of travel. Is that correct?
Oh, absolutely. It's always something, right? There's always a crisis somewhere. You just have to look. But yeah, the impacts of the pandemic on travel sentiment have obviously waned considerably now. I think most travelers are making the mindset shift from pandemic travel to endemic travel, and that's a plus side. But on the other hand, we've had record inflation growing month over month for the past several months, and no quick end in sight for that yet, depending on which economist you listen to, and so that's raising concerns. And the good news is that 9 out of 10 American travelers tell us that they have plans to go somewhere within the next 6 months. So the pent-up demand is there. They're booking travel. You look at the booking sites and so forth. They're all seeing great surges of activity right now, but at the same time, as travelers are determined to make that trip, they are now finding that they have to reallocate some of their travel budgets to make sure that trip happens. And that's going to mean spending a little bit less in some of the other key sectors of our industry, like dining and souvenirs, recreation, entertainment, maybe even the type of lodging they choose to stay in, and so forth. So it does have an impact, and it also will impact the types of trips they choose to take. Typically, when gas prices have spiked like they are now here in the U.S., we've seen a greater focus on regional travel, regional drive market travel versus long haul. And when you combine that with the outlook for international outbound from the U.S. to abroad, that the skyrocketing airfares for some Americans could make it cost prohibitive for them to travel abroad this summer.
You've been doing research specifically on the pandemic and coming out with your report every couple of weeks. Let's hope that continues even if we come out of the pandemic and you focus on things like rising fuel costs and so on. But one of the things that's very interesting that came out of it from my point of view was about resident sentiment, about how keen are people to receive visitors. And I wonder if there's been any first of all, any perception that people aren't keen, or indeed they're keener to see people.
I think that depends on what part of the country you live in. Over here, there were some areas of our country pre-pandemic that were dealing with some serious visitor management issues. The term of over-tourism, should we use it for this conversation? There, those destinations, we're seeing a lot of the residents kind of saying enough before the pandemic, and then they have this break during the pandemic, and or if they were in outdoor areas, they may have even seen a greater influx. So there's kind of been this push-pull. Overall, we're seeing generally American residents are ready to welcome visitors back into their communities. About 7 out of 10 tell us that they're perfectly fine with welcoming these visitors back in their communities now. That's up from, I mean, at the heights of the pandemic, that was, maybe 30, 35, only 35% were willing to, accept those visitors at some point. So we've seen that, literally double over the last several months. But, that still means that 1 out of 3 residents aren't that great about having these visitors coming back into their communities. So it just demonstrates that destination marketing organizations, local tourism industry partners, the stakeholders need to be constantly engaged with their local community, with the residents in that community, and informing them, on how they're asking visitors to be responsible. Show them how you're asking them to travel responsibly and sustainably through their communities, and work together with the community to figure out the best ways to manage these visitors. If the visitors, our research has shown time and time again over the last several years, if the residents feel involved in the process, if they feel that they're being heard or have a stake in the process, then they will be much more welcoming of the growth and development of the local tourism industry.
It's interesting because, I mean, I would imagine that, by most people's standards, resident sentiment would have been one of the pillars of destination management pre-pandemic, but it's definitely a pillar now, much more emphasis on it now.
It is. It's interesting because for most destination organizations pre-pandemic, to them, the most important customer was the visitor, right? And there was a little bit of a mindset shift that was starting to be espoused, especially the great folks at Destinations International, about a year before the pandemic, said actually the most important customer is the resident of your community. And so that mindset shift was starting to happen, but the pandemic just accelerated that. And I think most destination organizations will agree now that one of the new key KPIs, key performance indicators of a destination's success, health, and vitality is actually the resident sentiment. So
yeah,
not just room nights and visitor spending anymore.
It's interesting because I spoke to, I think it's Jack at Destinations International about his research, and it's not just in the USA, it's global, that the move towards destination management and destination stewardship being a key factor in destination management practice. Anecdotally, I know you've probably not done a great deal of research, but do you get a feel that Americans are ready now to travel overseas, or do you think that the Ukraine-Russia conflict is putting a dampener on that, or is it more to do with maybe rising costs again?
I think it's inflation more than anything else. The crisis in Ukraine right now, the conflict between Ukraine and Russia, I think that hampers Americans' views about what destinations to choose if they're heading, especially if they were looking at more towards Eastern Europe. It causes some hesitancy there, obviously. But I think the biggest threat to outbound American travel right now is the inflation, the rising airfares, as well as depending on which country they're looking at, the perceived hassle of traveling to and within the destination, right? Many countries have, like in the UK, where you are, obviously they've loosened most of the restrictions now about entering, and the pre-testing and post-testing and quarantining and all that. But there are many countries that still have those. Actually, here in the US, right, we still require a pre-test to come into the US. So those rules and regulations aren't uniform from country to country, and those rules can change arbitrarily and sometimes overnight still. And I think that still keeps American travelers looking at outbound international as a little bit of a hassle. In fact, our latest survey that came out a few days ago showed that of those who are changing their travel plans, right now, about 25% of those who are changing travel plans are choosing to travel domestically versus internationally. So there's still about a quarter of these travelers that are saying, yeah, I want to go internationally, but it's just not quite ready for it yet.
No. The other thing is, I was lucky enough to travel around Florida for 3 weeks earlier this year. And the one thing that I did notice was that it was very busy. Secondly, the entire state appeared to have been busy almost throughout the pandemic, and domestic tourism generally seems to be very, very buoyant. Is there any evidence that that bubble is about to burst or not?
I don't think so. When it comes to domestic leisure travel, what you were seeing, which was primarily domestic leisure, the Southeast U.S., like areas like Florida, where you saw, they all had record years last year. They did, and they're forecast to have record years this year. Again, we'll probably see a little more shrinking of people's target areas of where they're going, a little less long haul, a little more regional drive market, simply because of the gas prices and the inflation. But the volume's still going to come there. The demand is still there. The big X factors are, when does the business travel truly kick in? It's still only at about 65% of pre-pandemic volumes here in the U.S., depending on whose research you're looking at. The meetings and conventions that have rebooked, those really will kick in later this year and into next year. And then, of course, the international factor. You look at a destination like Florida, you mentioned, which is, a significant part of their pre-pandemic visitation was the international visitation. It's still a trickle of what it was before. Now thankfully it's a trickle. A year ago it was nothing, but we're looking at least what, a 2-3 year recovery still for those markets to kick back in. But yeah, overall in the U.S., the domestic leisure recovery is fully underway for sure.
Well, it all sounds fairly positive, Amir, but as we said, one hurdle comes, one hurdle goes, another one will pop up any time, but Christ knows what that is. But thank you very much for your insight once more, and I do appreciate your time today.
My pleasure. Anytime, Graham. For you, I'm all